Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Second Party Podcast. Like many people, one of my first kind of W-2'd jobs was in the food service industry. You know, it was one of those basically minimum wage type of jobs that you're getting still in high school, and, you know, your parents tell you got to go out and get a job to pay for gas and stuff, right? One of those jobs. And you know, looking back, I really hated the job a lot in some ways, but in some other ways, I think I also learned a lot from that job that really kind of propelled me forward. Like, I'm really actually happy that I had that job and was able to learn those things, particularly at that point in my life. So I figured maybe we could sit down and talk about some of what I learned at my first job and maybe some of what my wife learned at some of her early on jobs. What are you laughing at me?
My non-existent jobs. Is that what you're referring to? What I learned with my lack of jobs?
Well, you nannied, but you also had like
I didn't really have
things.
I didn't really have real jobs, quote unquote real jobs. I didn't think they were real. And my parents would always tell me, like, you should get, you know, a real job somewhere.
By real, do you mean like a W-2 job?
Yeah, like a job where you're employed by an actual institution of some
So
type.
at that
Not
age,
like
it's
random
probably, like,
babysitting, which is what I did.
Sure. So at that age, it's probably like food service or retail, something like that.
Yeah, like a job where you're, you know, you're clocking in, you're clocking out, you're getting paychecks. Like, I just worked, like, I was a nanny for a few different families and I did a bunch of babysitting. So I made okay money doing that. Like, I would do it a few days a week. I also would direct traffic after school. So I guess
Sure.
technically I had like a W-2 or whatever from that, but that was like legitimately 20 minutes a day.
Well, up at college, you had like a food service type job.
In college, okay. In college, I got a job, at the dining center, I guess. Honestly, I forget about that because I kind of erased that semester from my memory. It was only one semester I worked that job.
Okay.
I forgot about that until you just said it right now. But in high school, I don't think I really worked quote-unquote real jobs. Or I worked for my mom a little bit because she like had her own business, so I'd help her list or ship, package things up, that kind of thing. But again, it was like she would just kind of pay me some money. I didn't think it was like a real job.
Sure. Okay. Well,
And clearly my parents didn't think it was a real job either.
okay. Well, I guess by contrast, I had a number
You had
of
a real
different
job.
W-2 jobs. Like I mentioned it earlier, but I've done like food service and retail. Those to me are like the couple of main ones.
Yeah, well, we knew each other in high school. I think we've talked about that before, but I really liked that you had a job where you did, because it was at like a fast food restaurant, food service kind of place. And I would get free food all the time.
Yeah, I mean, you're
So I loved it.
only seeing like the positive side of that.
Of course,
I guess,
because I wasn't working yet. It was great for me. I would go in without you, and your manager would recognize me and comp my meal. It was the best thing ever.
Okay. So I guess one of the things that I think you kind of missed out on with having a job like that is maybe what I would describe as like this dead end feeling. Okay? Something where you're clocking in and you're clocking out and you feel like you're not actually getting anywhere with things. Right? Because when you go to work nowadays as an engineer, you know that at the end of the day, whatever productive things you've gotten done, those are going to matter, at least to some degree, 3-4 years from now, especially cumulatively.
Yeah, you're saying it's like working a job where you're basically just doing some maintenance thing that needs to happen because there needs to be someone there doing it. You're not making strategic improvements or working towards a specific goal within the work you're doing. You're showing up, you're doing the work because it's just something that needs to be done to keep up with whatever daily things have to happen at your workplace, per se.
Yeah, but I'm even saying, like, for you personally, right? Like, maybe the best way to characterize it is like the difference between a job and a career. As an engineer, each year that you're working in engineering, you're building up new skills, you're understanding more things, and you're furthering your career. Versus a job, like, we're not trying to go anywhere with these skill sets, right?
You're trying to make money, essentially.
Yeah, like, you're just clocking in, you're flipping burgers, you're clocking out. We're not trying to learn anything. We're not trying to gain some additional skill set or, strive towards some greater next step.
I guess.
Most of the time.
But to a degree, I'm not a very, quote-unquote, career-oriented person. Like, I don't really care that much about my quote-unquote career. Work to me is kind of like a way to make money. And if I didn't have that, I wouldn't be doing it.
Yeah, but there's part of, like, the dead-end job thing is there's not some path to making more money. Like, as an engineer, after approximately X many years, if I'm performing really well, then I can, and I continue to take on larger and larger projects, I can move up to the next engineering level, right? Whether that be senior or, principal or whatever the next engineering level is. Versus when you're, doing the equivalent of flipping burgers at McDonald's, while some people have, some next step as like, oh, I want to be a shift manager and then a full manager. Like, most people who are working at McDonald's are working at McDonald's temporarily, right? Their goal is not to move up in the McDonald's hierarchy.
Okay. So this dining center job that I had in college for literally one semester, because it was so horrible I quit after one semester. Does that count? Is what you're talking about? Dead end kind of job environment.
Kind of.
Obviously, I did not do that for very long.
Yeah.
So I can mildly relate that.
Yeah, kind of. So I guess one of the things that I learned, because I started working at a pretty young age, and this job I got relatively young. But one of the things that I really realized, and this was critical at that point in life, was that this is not something that I wanted to do going forward.
Well, and you were actually there for a considerable amount of time for a high schooler, I should say.
Yeah, I wasn't
a couple years.
Jumping around jobs all the time like some people did. Yeah, and I think that allowed me to really realize, have it really cement in my mind that, like, this is not what I want to do, right? And I think sometimes people will sit here and they go into their career and they think to themselves, oh, yeah, I want to make a bunch of money. Like, that'll be wonderful. That'll be great. And that's a great thing to run towards. But I think the best results are found when you're not only running towards something, but you're also running away from something, right? You've got, like, a positive and a negative motivation. And I certainly had that positive motivation because I understood what life with some degree of financial security and freedom and ability to do things looked like. But I think that first job really cemented what I was running away from, right? And gave me that additional boost. And I think that's something really critical that people can take out of one of those jobs, one of those first type of jobs that you get.
Yeah, if indeed that is something that you don't want to do.
Yeah, but either way, you have an understanding. If you decide, oh yeah, actually, like, I just don't want to have any responsibility, really, and yeah, I'm totally fine just, clocking in, clocking out, doing the burger flipping thing, listening to some music, whatever, then great. But then
So what is it about that job then that made you decide it was not something you wanted to do long term, or that it was so horrible or whatever?
Sure. So I think the best way that I can characterize this food service job, and I think a lot of food service jobs are like this as well. For me, it required enough attention to where I couldn't just entirely zone out.
Like driving.
Yeah, like,
You're talking about like when you're driving and it's like
sure.
you just zone out.
It's
like,
just automatic, and you can be thinking about whatever, and you can be listening to music, and you can be totally competently driving.
right, and then you get to where you're driving, you ever have this happen and you're like, wait, how did I get, you have a second, how did I get here? I almost don't remember driving here. Or do you
Yeah.
ever have those instances where you go through a light and then you're just past the light and you're like, that was green, right? Do you ever
Yeah,
get
yeah.
that?
Yeah, or, well, the other side of this is when you're going to some place that's near a place that you frequent, and you're just on autopilot, and you just start taking yourself to the place that you frequent instead of the place that you're actually trying to go. Yeah, so like it's just so ingrained in you. For me, at least, the type of food service job that I did, most of the time I was interacting with customers in some capacity, right? So think about something like being like the cashier ringing someone up. You can't just totally zone out.
Right.
You can have a bunch of functions that are automatic, right? Somebody says, oh, and can I get a soft drink with that? You don't have to think about hitting the button, but you still have to be engaged enough with whatever customer, right? And there's enough variability. So on one side, there's enough variability that you can't entirely zone out. But then on the other side is it's not mentally engaging enough. It's too simple, it's too basic, it's too boring.
That you're just bored out of your mind.
Yeah,
But not so bored that you can just zone out.
exactly. It's like I would rather have hot water or cold water, but this lukewarm stuff in the middle is just so terrible. Like either other way would have been preferable. So it exists in this like just terrible middle ground. And I think it was then that I realized that part of what I wanted in a career in whatever, or maybe it cemented this in my mind, was a level of mental engagement. Like that is something that I needed in a job.
Well, yeah. And not to mention at that job, you're customer facing, and any job being customer facing is going to have some really low points, I'm sure.
Yeah.
You just get bad customers who are rude and you have to deal with that and they yell and they're whatever. I remember you telling me a story one time about how someone came in like with a gun and it was like actually a bad situation.
Yeah, the cops were called. Somebody
Yeah.
came in screaming with a gun. That's pretty wild.
So then you got to deal with stuff like that, which doesn't help the whole
Yeah.
having a good time at work
Yeah.
goal.
I guess maybe that's a good segue into like the second thing that I really learned in the job, and that's that no matter how trivial a role is, there's still a level of importance and there's still a level of effect that you can have on people. Like I
Like
remember
there's a dignity to working a job no matter what kind of you're doing.
Well, and not just that there's a dignity to it. That's certainly a part of it. I don't disagree at all. But also that you doing a good job does matter. And I realized this because I worked at one of these restaurants where it was kind of like a chain, and there were a couple of locations kind of close. And when I worked there, the manager and the team was really quite friendly and efficient, and as a result, people would come from a wider area to our location than some of the other locations that they maybe would have been closer to, specifically because of the experience at this establishment.
Yeah, that location was really quite good.
And the other thing was because everyone started coming to that location, right? Then not only is it critical that you keep that up, but also it almost demands more of you, because now you're also kind of fighting the increased number of people, right? Because people don't want to sit around for an hour. So I really realized that even in some trivial role, right, whether you're like a cashier or you're flipping burgers, like you can do a really good job at that, and you can help people's days be better, or you can do a really crappy job at that and make people's days worse.
Yeah. I mean, not to mention just like relationships that you can build with the people you're working. Like, you had a really good relationship with your manager to where it was, like I was saying before, I would go in without you just to get food for myself, and she would comp my meal because she recognized me and knew me and, had a good relationship with you and whatever. And even more recently, when we've gone back to that location in the past couple of years, and we're recognizing some of the same people who work there, who are still working there, or the manager every now and again when she's still there, like, they would recognize us and talk to us and manager comp our meals. Like, however many years removed we are from this now, like 7, 8 years or something like that.
Yeah, that wasn't like on my mental list of things to take away, but I do think that definitely is a bit of a takeaway. Like, reputation matters so much, actually. And like that's a great
having
example.
Having good relationships with people too. I mean, you never know when you're going to encounter them again. I don't know that fully ties into the point you were trying to make right there, but it was another thing I was thinking about.
Yeah. So those are kind of like main things that I learned in the position, and I think that most people could or do learn similar types of lessons in some of those first jobs that they had. But there was kind of another weird thing that I guess I learned, and maybe I'm reading into this a little bit too much, but I had a very weird realization that I kind of pondered a number of different days that I was working there. And maybe people who also worked in food service stuff can tell me if that's also something that they've experienced. But one of the things that I observed is, working on this job, an order would come in, and one of my jobs would be to like kind of scoop the food according to the order or whatever the customer was requesting. And like I mentioned, you'd get bored pretty quickly, right? It's this kind of monotonous thing. It's not terribly engaging. And people say, oh, I get bored all the time nowadays. And most of the time where I hear somebody saying, oh, I'm bored, I think to myself, why are you so bored? Like, you can go do a litany of things. But in this instance, I think I can confidently say that I was bored because there wasn't a litany of other things that you could do. And the thing that I was doing was not mentally engaging. Like taking some order that someone barks at you and dishing it up doesn't require that much brain power. So I would kind of zone out a little bit, but still have to be a bit engaged. And, you're listening to customers, so you can't really listen to music. And I noticed slowly over time, kind of subconsciously, I started seeing the food that I was scooping in like a very different way than I had previously seen it. Like, when I was scooping the food, I wasn't oblivious to the fact that like somebody who's ordering this would be consuming it later, right? I still mentally understood that this was food, but something became almost like kind of warped in my perception to where I didn't see, this vat of stuff as food. Like, that's not how my mind registered that thing. Like when you look at something, you look at one of the outlets on a wall, right? And your mind doesn't just say, oh, that's a plug-in for power, right? There's part of your mind that says, that's a face.
Oh, well, that's a whole psychological thing with humans where we see faces everywhere. But yeah.
But I'm saying, like, this is the same kind of thing. Like, my perception was just completely changed on this thing. Like, I was no longer thinking.
Since working there, you, like, look at food differently?
No, like, when I was working there, like, you get behind the counter and there are a bunch of things you could scoop up. In my head, I was not thinking, oh, I'm scooping food for this person. It was just like, no, I scoop out of that bin and put it there. There was no recognition that, like, this was food.
I mean, it's kind of like, you know, when you say a word over and over again and then it stops sounding like a word.
Yeah, that's another great comparison. Yeah, because it was like, I'm scooping food this many times, and then it's no longer in your head like food. Like, I may as well have been scooping sand. One day, I was sitting and, you know, there was a bit of a lull, and I thought to myself, like, man, I'm really hungry. And I distinctly remember thinking to myself, like, shoot, where would I find food? Like, I'd have to go home. And...
like, you're sitting in front of...
and, yeah, it dawned on me, like, no, there's literally, like, probably about 100 pounds of food within, you know, a 10-meter radius of me. And no part of me was like, oh, yeah, that's food. It was a really weird realization. And it was slightly frightening, the degree to which my perception was warped. And I began, like, really contemplating this for days. And I came to this kind of, like, haunting realization. And this is probably going to sound like kind of, you know, dramatic or something, but I just thought to myself, like, this is the same kind of mentality that, like, most of the people on the ground who were Nazis had.
What?
Well, just stick with me for a second here, okay?
You're losing me.
Okay, so they went about their day-to-day tasks that they were told to do, right? And the first few times, like, I'm sure they were like, oh, man, and they understood what was happening, right? Just like I understood the first few times, like, oh, yeah, like, I'm scooping this food into this container, right? But after you do it, like, a dozen times...
okay, you're talking about the ability of the human psyche to disconnect itself from reality, or the reality of the situation in front of them.
Yeah.
Extended out to a much, much more extreme example that you just gave.
Yeah, but
0
like...
to 100.
I know, but like, let's say you're some grunt worker for the Nazis, right? In their eyes, they weren't filling up planes to fly and go bomb some people. They weren't contributing in like the mass deaths of like thousands of people. That's not what they were thinking.
Thousands. Millions.
Well, I'm saying the individuals.
Okay.
One plane, right? Like, they were just thinking, I'm putting fluid into some metal machine, you know, just like anybody else. It's like filling up a car with gas, right? You don't think when you're filling up your car with gas anymore, even. Like, oh, yeah, like, this is this crazy flammable whatever. You just think, like, it just becomes automatic, right? They weren't, like, rounding up families and separating kids from parents to be murdered in their heads, right? In their heads, they're just cleaning up the city streets, right? Because it just becomes this automatic thing.
Right.
They've done it a dozen times.
Reprogrammed.
Yeah.
In their mind, almost.
Yeah, they weren't like thinking, oh yeah, I'm like torturing and starving and experimenting and murdering millions of people. I'm just trying to defeat the bad guys and make our country great again and make my parents proud and like have a purpose. Like, that's what's going through their minds.
Many of them. Yeah. I mean, not all of them. most likely. But you're talking
No,
about
but I'm saying
how
like that's how most people probably were.
you're talking about
with
how
it.
they were able to, like, we sit here now and we say, how on earth did people not like see this coming or put an end to it? How did people just sign on to this? You're saying perhaps that ability to disconnect in your mind from the reality of the situation and have a warped perception of what you're actually doing perhaps contributed to how so many people were drawn into and consentingly did all these terrible, terrible things.
Yeah, I think that's a massive thing, a massive contributing reason. Now, like, obviously, I'm not saying that scooping food's like being a Nazi, but I just realized in that specific moment, like, it was so clear to me how easily our perceptions are warped and how this is, like, at least in my opinion, really critical to understanding how something like the Holocaust happens. Like this, and I want to be clear, it's not an excuse at all. In fact, I think it serves to like humble us even more, right? Because I think too often people like to think like, oh, we're so different than them. We're so much more civilized, right? And you can extrapolate this to tons of other things, like, oh, obviously, like, we're so much more civilized than the Aztec. Like, I can't imagine people doing that, or like I can't imagine these public executions. Like, these people are just so horrible, and we're so much more civilized. We're so much better than they were, and it's like,
well, yeah, it's like
you're not so different.
Trying to put things in perspective a little bit and understand that, in some sense, hindsight is 20/20. Right? Like, it's easy to sit here in the future after the dust has settled and we can look back at history and see, for the most part, the bigger picture of everything. And then we can point at these people and say, how could you, I can't believe you would do that. And it's like, yeah, how do you know if you weren't in that situation?
You're saying people are playing
like,
Monday morning quarterback. Like, you weren't there. You can't say that you wouldn't have whatever. Like,
yeah, which you're saying is not an excuse to the people doing the atrocities, but more it's a call to us now to try and look back and understand even the fact that we have this perspective that is broader than they had at the time, and maybe have some humility about where in your heart or your mind might you be potentially susceptible to, like, we don't all have the full perspective and broader picture even now.
Yeah,
How do we know in 100 years there aren't going to be people looking back on us now and with this exact same mentality? Oh, I can't believe, can you believe what this society was doing? I'm sure there are, I hope that in 100 years, society will look back at some of the things happening now and have that mentality.
Yeah, I agree. And I think this is at least in part what is meant, not wholly summarizing, but I think this is in part what is meant by the phrase that's often used when talking about the Holocaust of, like, never forget. Like, I think part of it is that's
not the Holocaust. That's 9/11.
So, okay, yeah, I'm looking here. It's used with 9/11, but it is also definitely used with the Holocaust, like as a quote.
Okay, when I hear that phrase, I think 9/11 is the big one.
Okay, that's kind of interesting. I think the Holocaust.
Okay.
But
I mean, both of them are things.
Sure.
Like you could apply the same mentality.
Yeah,
to both.
I guess.
Never forget.
I guess what I mean is that phrase, when used in relation to the Holocaust, I think at least in part means that we are not supposed to forget that we are not so different from the Nazis. Never forget the atrocities that they committed. Never forget how easily people rationalize their behavior, or how easily people's perceptions get warped. Never forget the horrors that lurk beneath the surface in everyone, just waiting for an excuse to make themselves manifest, or the powers of peer pressure, or that it takes people to stand up and stop things like this from happening. Right? Never forget that it's always lurking in the background. I think, like, people hear others espouse beliefs that, we're like, oh, so horrible. And, like, yes, of course, our society has improved in many measurable ways. But I think it's naive to think that we're so different from those other people. And, like, almost to a disturbing level. Like, there are so many things that we do now that, like, aren't so different.
And that's one hell of a lesson from a fast food job.
Well, in the few times that I was able to, like, actually think for a bit during a lull, like, these were the things I was
This is where your
thinking.
mind wins.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, I figured, well, I'm already kind of, like, depressed and feeling kind of aimless in this job, so may as well contemplate
Take it to the extreme.
some of the extremes. Yeah, so I'd sit here and just be like, yeah, I mean, we experiment on people now, just like the Nazis did. Like, they ran crazy experiments, choosing unwilling participants. We just trick people unable to consent and run similar crazy experiments on them. Like, I hope...
What are you talking about?
What am I talking about?
Children?
Yeah.
And, yeah.
Like, I hope we look back on that like we're looking back on the things that the Nazis did, thinking, how could anyone do that? Yeah, but I hope that we look back and see it as an atrocity. I hope we don't question how could people do that. Like, it should be painstakingly clear to everyone how somebody could do that. Like, we destroy the downtrodden. The Nazis rounded up people in the street and sent them to concentration camps. We just encourage them to come here and live in the streets and allow people to hurt each other. We tell people lies controlling their lives for political gain. The Nazis had propaganda in the Nazi youth. We just tell people that the world is against them. The world's going to burn and die, take their money for our political gain. Like, I'm not saying that we make people suffer as much, but to think that it's all gone is concerningly naive.
No, there's always evils in our world, right? It's a problem if you assume that we have or we can eliminate evil entirely in this life.
Yeah, I mean, I think even some of the worst things that the Nazis did, like, I see parallels nowadays. We kill innocents too. We just characterize them. We characterize people as less than, as subhuman. Yeah, like the Nazis.
Human non-persons.
Yeah, the Nazis rounded up Jews, people who were mentally challenged dissenters, and they just characterized them as burdens on the state, subhuman. They called them rats, the evil parasites. Like, tell me how this is substantially different. Like, we just kill babies before they're born. Almost the exact same language, like disturbingly so, is used. Oh, frickin' parasites. No, don't even get me started on the mentally challenged thing. Like, yeah, the Nazis did it. Oh, it's so terrible that, yeah, we do the same thing. Literally the same thing. We call people subhumans, burdens on the state, unwanted, parasites. Yeah, like, I legitimate.
Canada has this whole, what do they call it?
Oh yeah, where they're just killing old people, or
it's like the assisted suicide. I don't know. It's disturbing.
Yeah. I'm not trying to be a downer, but
no,
I legitimately think, like, when people get up, there should be an intellectual part of you that is able to look in the mirror and see like a soldier staring back at you.
Well, it's
Like somebody with the same flaws, with the same mentality and evil that the Nazis had, right? Like someone who could easily fall into that mentality of like, oh, I'm just following orders.
it's like what Jordan Peterson talks about, right? With recognizing the monster that's within you
Yeah.
and recognizing the evil that is there. Understanding that there is evil that just permeates our world is actually really important.
Yeah. And I think you kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, but like understanding that we can't fully eradicate evil.
Right.
Right.
That it's not going to happen in this lifetime. It will, right? It will happen. We have a hope in that. And that doesn't mean that we aren't supposed to do everything we can to help mitigate it, to help those who are hurting, to bring justice to evildoers. But I think you do that with also this understanding of, it is something that we just have to contend with in this life. I mean, you have to accept the reality of it.
Yeah, I think that's part of what is meant by that phrase, like, never forget, right? Don't forget that that's sitting there, like, just lurking.
Well, it's like the devil crouching at your door, right? Waiting to devour you.
Yeah, and that's a great comparison. Like, I forget who said it, but, like, the greatest trick the devil played.
It's convincing the world he doesn't exist.
Yeah. Like, when you take your eyes off of, right, like the cheetah or whatever. Have you seen those videos where there'll be like a cheetah, right, or some large cat, a lioness or something like that, and it's in like a cage, and you've got one of the zoo workers, right, and when the zoo worker turns their back, it's not even like the lion or cheetah or what have you is thinking, oh, well, that's the zoo worker, right? Its perceptions are just so automatic that it just goes into this mode of like stalking and getting ready to pounce on this person. Mm-hmm. And then when the person turns around, it's like it's a whole different mental thing for that animal, right? It doesn't even recognize it as prey anymore because now it's that person. I think we have to like keep our eyes on that evil, like and focus on that, because in focusing on it, you can ensure that it's brought into the light and like kind of kept in check,
And by keeping your eyes and focusing on it, you just mean like, don't just write it off. We have to understand and grapple with the reality of it.
Yeah.
I don't think it means you need to sit and wallow in this depressing state of, oh, all this evil in the world, but you need to keep it in mind and have the reality of that incorporated into your worldview.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think when we take that and we put it in the light, right, we have to keep it in check with like that small part in us that protests, right? That small part that says no in the face of like fear, that says no in the face of peer pressure. The little part of you that says like, no, that's wrong. Like I should actually do something. When we don't lose sight of like that evil part, it's not allowed to grow as much, right? And I think if we lose sight of it, then it can grow. And it can grow large enough in individuals that, it sounds extreme, but like massive chapels and cathedrals and roads and Rome, like these were all built with single bricks. And each single person that has that mentality, right? Like the Holocaust was comprised of a bunch of individuals like that. And I pray that we don't forget to watch that evil part in us.
To not get desensitized to evil too, right?
Yeah.
Like scooping that food. Oh, that's not food anymore. Being so surrounded by evil where you're just like, oh, never mind. This is not even a problem. This is not evil. This is normal. Whatever. This is just a thing that I'm encountering in my life.
Yeah. And I think like that's a good point. Like when we normalize things, when we get desensitized to things, when we lie to ourselves, all of that is like, it's just slowly contributing and allowing like that darkness to grow. And that's something that I really realized when, scooping up food at my food service job for customers.
Yeah, like I said, that's one hell of a lesson. All right. Also, not where I thought you were going at all when we started this conversation.
Well, where did you think I was going? What other
not to the Holocaust.
Okay.
Not to the Holocaust.
Okay. Well, what things did you learn at some of your first jobs?
My non-jobs.
Sure.
I don't know. Nannying, I learned that babies are cute, and I want 50 of them, and they throw up a lot sometimes.
A lot. Okay.
Yeah, but it's okay.
They're still worth it, even with the throw up.
And even when it's not my kid.
That's actually a pretty interesting realization. Like, even if it's not your kid, right, you don't have that extreme level of investment, there's still part of you that like looks at some kid and is like, yeah, I know you threw up all over me and I have to change and that's a hassle, but like,
it's just a kid. It's a baby. Like, this is new life that's gonna be a whole grown person someday. Not that they're not, a whole person as a baby, but I'm saying they're gonna grow to an adult human being, and they're gonna go do amazing things. That's crazy.
Yeah, I kind of think like some similar things with like volunteering in like the kids' room. It's kind of cool seeing
at church. Yeah.
Yeah, at church, it's kind of cool seeing personalities start to develop. Like, usually I volunteer with like the 3 to 4 year olds. And that's kind of when you start seeing, like personalities, how each kid is actually into different things,
I like
has
seeing
different
personalities
interests.
Develop around that age. It's really cool.
I mean, like, babies are babies, right? You're not like, oh, this baby is super interested in cars versus that one dinosaurs.
I mean, yeah, different babies do have different personalities to a degree, but it gets more so as you get into the toddler and then preschool years, for sure.
Okay, well, maybe they can communicate their personalities more clearly then.
I thought you were going to say, I'm glad we're kind of lightening things up a little bit here. Let's just finish out on a light note, maybe. But I thought you were going to mention another thing you learned at your job that you've talked to me about, which is there is such a thing as working too hard.
Oh, that's a great reminder.
So, bonus lesson. Talk about that for a second.
Okay, yeah. So, in that same kind of food service job, I remember trying to take some of the lessons that my parents had talked to me about, right? Like, work really hard and, be really diligent, try and do the best work possible that you can, stuff like that. And, like, you'll be rewarded for that, obviously, right? And I remember thinking, like, okay, perfect. I'll apply that and I'll make more money and I'll be able to help people more. Like, this will be wonderful, right? So I put in like a bunch of extra effort and like I tried to just nail everything, right? Like, be really quick, be really efficient, be really friendly, stuff like that. And I remember going in and asking for a raise. I don't remember exactly what I was making, but I had been there for something like 6 months, right? I was getting paid like $8 an hour or something, right? Like basically minimum wage, maybe slightly above. And I remember I was asking for a bit of a raise. Okay, I think I was asking for like a dollar raise or something like that. And I remember they were hiring people on at like more than or almost the raise that I was asking for. So let's say I was getting paid $8 an hour. I was asking for $9. They were hiring people on at like $8.90 or something. So I thought, like, this is pretty reasonable, right? I'm already trained in, and I've been here for a while. I've been killing it.
Yeah.
You're paying me slightly more than what a new person would be, right? And they basically said, like, best we can do is 25 cents in a few months. And I remember just being like, what are you talking about?
That's completely bogus.
Like, that's such garbage.
Quit and reapply.
I remember saying, like, we're hiring people on at more than even when I do get that. Like, why don't I just quit and get rehired?
So why didn't you?
Because they were like, yeah, I mean, we don't, like, rehire people like that. And I was kind of coming to, maybe I was 9 months in. I was kind of coming to a point where I was like, I'm not going to be working here that much longer, right? Trying to go and find some other job for, like, less than 6 months doesn't really make sense because I was going to go off to college and stuff. And so I just didn't end up doing anything with it, really. But I remember just sitting here and being like, what did I put in all of this extra work and effort for?
Well, and then especially when, like you've talked about before, you were so efficient at all these things that you were then given more responsibility because you could handle all that responsibility, and, like, your manager knew she could put this responsibility on you and you would get it done because you were such a good worker.
I was basically doing two people's full jobs. Like,
Right.
They had fewer people on a shift that I was on because I could handle that.
Right. But then it's like you were kind of working, quote unquote, too hard.
Yeah.
Because it's just like you weren't
There's
getting
no point.
compensated or recognized for it. And then what ended up happening is you had so much more work to do that you would get more stressed out, and it would be a harder day. You'd get more exhausted from a shift of work than someone getting, a brand new person getting paid more than you, doing less than you because they're not as good as you.
And then you're right. And then the thing on top of that is then that became the expectation.
Right.
So instead of thinking, like, let's say that 100% is you're performing all of your duties and you're doing them all perfectly, right? Or you could be performing more than all of your duties, but you're not quite doing them all perfectly, right? I was thinking, oh, okay, if I work 20% harder, then I'll get paid, like, more. And if I work 200%, then I'll get paid even more than that. But the reality is there's some point where
It's a bell curve.
you're not actually going to get paid more. Like, you're going to max out whatever it is. Now, I want to be clear. Like, this probably doesn't apply to entrepreneurial endeavors. And for some things at, like, the tops of industry, I'm sure that you can work harder and get paid, proportionally more or close to. But in a role like this, I didn't think, oh, I'm actually going to get paid double because I'm working 200%. But I did think, well, yeah, I think getting paid 20% more if I'm literally doing two people's jobs seems reasonable, right? But no. So, yeah, to your point, I really learned then that you can work too hard at a given job. And, like, instead, you should be working as hard as is necessary to, like, probably max out whatever you're getting paid there. But then any effort beyond that should really be put into some other endeavor.
Places where your fruit will be more valued, probably.
Yeah. And I think it's just that was really a tough lesson for me to learn, because everything up until that point in life, if I actually worked harder, if I actually did better, I had received better results. Whether that was playing sports or working harder in school to get better grades, or like I would do like more chores around the house for money, like beyond whatever my standard chores were, stuff like that. Like,
yeah, well, and
it all scaled.
That's something I see even in my current job, in
Yeah.
big I don't know, career type jobs even, where I'm a very independent worker at work. Like, I don't need a lot of supervision. I will take what has to be done and I will do it. And I will be a reliable team member to where people will feel comfortable coming to me and asking me to do things. Like, they're not going through my manager. And a lot of times my manager doesn't even necessarily know what I'm working on because I'm just putting out fires and resolving things so that, like, you don't have to know what's going on because I'm handling it already.
Yeah.
So it's almost like this weird thing where the better job you're doing, the less attention you're getting because you're doing the job better, but then the less recognition you're getting because no one really is seeing what you're doing. So
yeah. Well, I think
it's almost like finding that bell curve, I guess. And there's a degree where you get limitations with HR where it's like, yeah, you're doing a great job, but I can't promote you yet because you need to be here for X years. It's like a hard HR requirement.
Yeah, I
You
think
get things like that too.
I think the other thing is, like, you can think about it in proportions, right? Let's say that I'm doing literally two people's jobs, so 200%. At least at the company I'm working at, I am not going to get a 20% raise. It's not going to happen, period. I could do 300%. It's not going to happen, okay? So you have to find a point where, like, let's say, I'm doing 150%, right? I'm not expecting that I'm going to get a 50% raise, okay? But I am expecting, at least I did expect, oh, well, if I do 150%, right, maybe I'll get a 13% raise instead of a 5% or what have you, right? And I think I really realized back then, oh, there's clearly a cap and there's not really any sense in doing more beyond that. And it's actually probably to your detriment because then the expectation, right, that the zero bar just gets raised.
And then you're going to get yourself burned out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So those were, kind of three lighthearted. And then one definitely not lighthearted.
What do you say?
Yeah, things that I learned from my first job.
And I don't have lessons to share because I didn't work real jobs. But it's okay because I have you to share your lessons with me, and then I can take all of the benefits from your job, like the free food, the lessons that I don't have to learn the hard way. There we go.
Yeah. Well, with that, it's getting late. But recently I've been thinking about two things that I'm actually very against. I don't know if I've tweeted about these before, if I've talked about it on the podcast, but two things that I'm very against are hats and makeup. And I'm very against these as a general rule, because they both seem to try to lie to people who are seeing you, right? It's almost an admission that you're not great looking in one way or another, which, in the case of makeup and hats, I think it's fine in some cases. But in my mind, I always just assume the worst. Like, if you've got a super caked on face of makeup, there's something in me that doesn't think like, oh wow, like that person looks like that and they're attractive. In my mind, I just think, oh, you must be wearing a bunch of makeup because either A, you're not beautiful, or B, you don't think that you are. And by the way, the same thing applies to hats. Like, when people, I would say, like, terminally are wearing hats, my assumption is always just kind of with like a worst case scenario, right? I don't think, oh, somebody's got these luscious locks under that hat. Because when people wear hats consistently, to me it says, oh, I don't really like what my hair looks like. And if you actually really don't like what your hair looks like, and it is a worst case scenario, and you want to throw a hat on, that's fine. That makes sense. Cool, whatever. But for me at least, I'm very against hats and makeup in general. Because to me, it signifies a lack of confidence or acceptance of you, of yourself, Like if I started balding, if I started losing my hair, I would just go bald. I'd just shave it all off. I wouldn't try and, do the hat thing. But to each their own. I'm sure I'll catch a bunch of flack for this one, but that's fine. Midnight musings are sometimes for my more controversial opinions. It's things I'm just more musing about. So feel free to write in and tell me how wrong I am. You can send an email to us at secondpartypodcast@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you. With that, thank you again for listening. Have a good night.